Difference between a function and a method we have discussed. Function will be outside the class, method will be within the class. A method is called by using a object like this s1.display. A function called normally. A function called normally without any object, but a method is called by using object. s1.display. A method should always have self as parameter, but a function is not required. So difference between static and non-static we have discussed right yesterday. Okay. Written that, fine. Now let us see practically, right, the static variables. How to define a class. Okay. So multiple things you need to observe here. How to define a class, how to define a method, how to create an object, and how to access the static variables. Now here, class name. What is the class name? Sample. Class sample colon x equal to 10. X equal to 10 is what kind of variable? Static variable. It's a static variable, right? X equal to 10 is a static variable. Okay. def display, right? Display method. Enter print x equal. I want to print the x value. I want to print the x value. X is what? Static variable. How to access static variable within the class? How? Sample dot x class name within the class, outside the class. Use class name only to access. See that fourth point, I think something like fourth or fifth point. How to accessing a static variable. Which one you have written, right? Static variables if you want to access, right? Using class name within the class, from outside the class. This is important. Sample dot x. If you say just x, it gives error. Always static variable, if you want to print or if you want to access it, always use class name. Okay. Here, self I need to write. A method should always have self, I said. Difference between function and method. Method should have self, but function don't. A method should always have self as a parameter. A method should always have. A method should always have self as a parameter. As a parameter, right? Should have self parameter. What is stored by self? What is stored within the self means whichever object calls a method should always have self as a parameter. whichever object calls this method display, then address, then that object address is stored by self. One more method I'm defining, def show method self. Self method should always have self. Print x equal to, if I want to print x, comma sample dot x. Now this is the end of the class. End of the class. What a class consists of? How many variables? One variable. And how many methods? Two methods, display and show. We cannot say that as functions, but the only methods we'll have within the class. A class consisting of one variable and two methods. One variable and two methods, right? Okay. First, right up to here, class.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Next, everyone. Now observe here. To access, see what are the class members here? What are the class members here? Class members means one variable, static variable, and two methods. We call them as class members. To access the class members, create object, create a object. To access the class members, create a object. Object creation statement. How to create an object? Object creation statement in Python. Object creation statement, right? What is that? We say object name equal to class name. If you see in Java, class name, object name equal to new class name, you will say. Those who have got knowledge in Java. Class name, object name equal to new class name, you will say in Java, right? Here in Python, what is the object name? class name. Both we should provide for creating object, right? So here, let me create an object now. S1 object names here. What is the object name? S1 equal to which class object? Sample. In a program, you can have multiple classes, right? Sample one is one class, sample two is one class. So this S1 is the object of which class you are creating. Sample one, sample you need to give, right? So here creating object, right? So here a lot of things you need to understand what happens internally. Here a object gets created internally. Here a object gets created internally. And its address is stored in a variable called as reference variable. Here object gets created internally and its address is stored in a variable called as reference variable S1. Here object gets created internally and its address is stored in a variable called as, see here S1 we call it, whenever you say x equal to 10, right? X equal to 10, internally object gets created. Its address is stored by X. Here also S1 equal to sample means what you are assigning to S1. S1, what you are assigning to S1 means, see S1 equal to sample, a object gets created internally. That address is there, the target address. That address is stored by this S1. This S1 we call it as reference variable, right? Internally object created, its address is stored by this S1. Now, by using this, by using the reference variable S1, we can access the class members. By using this reference variable S1, we can access the class members, right? Okay. Now see this S1 dot display. S1 dot display, I will say, right? So from here S1 dot display means it goes here, executes. Compulsorily, how a method is called? By using object. Function called, see the difference between function and a method. Function called normally by using function name, but method always called by using, see that method always called by using object. Method always called by using object. Compulsory object is required. So here s1 dot s1, using this s1 object, s1 reference variable, I'm calling display. Here calling a method using object. Calling the method using object. Here s1 address is stored within the self of display. Here s1 address is stored within the self of display. Observe carefully here. Whenever I say s1 dot display, right? Whenever I say s1 dot display, this s1 address is stored. S1 address is stored in the self of display. This s1 address is stored in the self of display. What is stored in the self? I said just now, whichever object calls this method, that object address is stored by self. Now, which object is calling s1? Then what is stored in the self? The address of the s1 is stored in self. If I want to print the static variable from outside the class, how can I print the static variable x? Print x equal to what I should say, sample dot x. Understood, right? This one, accessing static variable from outside the class using class name. Static variable, accessing static variable from outside the class, using class name. Using what? Class name, right? Now observe this. Let me save it. Now run module. Existent exist. It is printing existent. So display method is called x equal to 10. And this x equal to 10 means from outside the class you are printing static variable using the sample.x. Now, if I want to call show also, you can call this show method also. Print. No. S1 dot show. So this display method printing X value. This X also it is printing. This show also 3. You will get 3 now. Run module. Understood everyone? Any queries in this? How to define a class, how to define a method, how to create an object, what happens internally, and how to access static variable within the class, outside the class. All this clear or not? Any query in this? I'll discuss more examples on the static variables. Next 3-4 examples I'll be discussing. Before that, have you understood this, right? Next, one more example, right? See more examples on this. Modifying static variables. Defining multiple methods within the class, modifying the values of static variables using a method. Now, first observe this, everyone. You can make a note later, but first, class test. What are these two variables? X equal to 10, y equal to 20. What kind of variables? Static variables. How many methods within the class? Two methods, M1 and M2. Method should always have self. For example, in the previous, go to the previous example. If I remove self here for display, if I want to use self, now see, will I get error or not? You check. Error you got, right? Compulsory, self is compulsory for a method. For function, not required. Up to now, we have seen my functions, right? We never used any self within the function, right? But method compulsory, self required. What is stored in the self means which object is calling this function method, display method S1. S1 address will be stored in self. So if you want to understand more on this self in non-static variable, you can understand more on this self, because observe yesterday non-static variables, fourth or fifth point, how you can access non-static variable within the class. How to access non-static variable using self. So for static, we won't use any of this, right? But in non-static, we will be discussing more on this self. What is self? Defining multiple methods within the class. Defining multiple, modifying the values of static variables using a method. Okay. Two static variables, two methods, M1, M2, M1 and M2, two methods, right? How can I access this X within this test.x? How to access Y? Test.y. Directly, I cannot say X and Y. Always static variable, class name, test.x, test.y, right? Modifying the values of X and Y. X was 10, Y was 20. Now I'm saying X value modified to 30, Y value modified to 40. Now DEF M2 method, print test.x, test.y. Okay. So within the class, static, two methods, modifying the static variables and printing the values, right? First take up to here, we'll discuss. Right. Fast, make it fast. Okay. So here two static variables, two methods, right? Here M1 method, first printing the XY values and modifying to 30, 40. In M2, just printing the values. Understood, right? Now, what is this T1 equal to test? Object creation statement. Compulsory object to be created. Here internally object is created and its address is stored in by a variable called reference variable T1. Just before I said, right? Here internally T1 equal to test means object creation statement. Internally object creates. That object address is stored by variable T1. Using T1, first T1 dot M2 if I call. Observe everyone, try to answer this. T1 dot M2 if I call, from here the control goes to M2. What is stored in the self? T1 address will be stored. Now T1 dot M2 means what is the X and Y values it is printing. What is the values? 10, 20. Why? Because if you call this M1 method, then only it control goes here, then only it will modify that value to 30, 40. Until then it won't modify, right? If I call this M1 method, then only control goes here and modifies first prints 1020 and modifies to 3040. If m1 up to here m1 method not executed, right, means what is that m2 prints 1020 only. Understanding? Now m1 method called print x and y. What is x and y value? Xy value what? 1020. Xy value is what? 1020. First m1 it will control goes to this m1, it will print 1020. Next it will modify to 3040. First itself it won't print 3040. First it prints that existing x and y value 1020. Next it is modifying the 3040. Understand? Now if I call m2 method, what is that value? 3040. Now again if I call m1, 3040 will be printed, next 3040. Understood now?
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Please, I would like you to re-explain. Please.
So here, observe everyone. Have you understood this class first? Defining class first, you say this class you have understood. Yes, Abraham.
Yes, I understand that.
Class you have understood, right, everyone? Now,
Yes.
we need, for accessing this class members, we need to create object. This object creation, you
I
understood?
understand. Yes.
Object creation, you understood. Now,
Yes.
first I am calling which method? M2 method. T1 dot M2.
Okay.
If I call M2 method, it prints the x and y values. X and y values, what are the values? 1020, right?
Okay.
It will print 1020. Fine, this one. X
Okay.
value is going to print 1020. Understood up to here, everyone? Next.
Yes.
Now, if I'm calling M1 method also prints that XY value. That is what? 1020. 10 and 20. 10 and 20, right?
Okay.
After printing 1020, the X value modified to 30, Y value modified to 40. But it won't print, it just modifies. So this statement execution finished, right? Now, if I call M2 method,
Sorry, can I ask one question where you get A now?
yes.
Now, meaning that if you want to modify a variable, you need to call the class name dot that variable to modify, to do modification. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you want to, yes, this static variable x and y is there. If you want to access it, class name dot x, class name dot y. Even if you want to, if you x, if you cannot say normally x, test dot x, always class name dot y. Static variable, if you want to print or if you want to access or if you want to modify, always use class name before it.
Okay, fine, I understand.
From outside the class also, if you want to print, use class name. From within the class also, static variable, class name. Understood this, everyone now? Static variables are nowhere related to objects. Static variable x Is it related to any object or is nowhere related to objects? Static variables always takes the modified values only. If you modify a static variable, then the changes will be reflected in all the methods and objects. Always the modifier updated static variable value will be considered. Understood? Write these points. Yes. Okay. Static variables and objects are nowhere related. I'm not saying s1 dot x or s1 dot y, right? I'm saying sample dot x, sample dot y. I'm using class name. I'm not using object name, right? Static variables always takes the modified values. If you modify a static variable, then the changes will be reflected in all the methods and objects. Always the modifier updated static variable value will be considered. So I've created another object, right? I'm creating another object, t2 equal to test. t2 dot m2 means what is the xy value it is going to print? t2 dot m2 means control goes to m2 and prints that x and y value. What is the xy value it is going to print?
1020.
1020 or 3040? 3040. M1 also 3040. Now modifying to 5060, right? Now what it prints? 5060. Now M2 method is called means prints 5060 first. Next changes to 3040. M1 method. M1 and M2 method, right? M2 method prints 3040. M1 and M2. Again, if I call M1, M2, what is the output it is going to print? 3040, 3040, 3040, 3040. See that last, all it is going to print 3040. 3040, 3040. This 3040, 3040, 3040, 3040, 3040, right? In this way, it is going to print. Okay, once check these things practically. Okay, t1 dot m2, right? T1 dot m2, first observe here, already they got modified. So 3040 it will print. Again it will go to m2, prints 3040. Again m1 means 3040 it prints. Again modified to 3040. Now it will be modified to 5060, print 5060. M2 prints 5060, M1 prints 5060 and modifies to 3040. Once check this thing, right? So finish writing.